Our constitution promises dignity for all in South Africa, but race still determines our life opportunities. Is the law anti-black? And what can we learn from Black Lives Matter in the US?
Western Cape government is anti-black.
Crossing the road, there's a parking which is got the electricity, but the human beings haven't got the electricity. So the cars are more important than us.
What does it actually mean to engage in a solidarity economy?
We, the people of South Africa, recognize the injustices of our past, honor those who suffered for justice and freedom, commit to heal the divisions and improve the quality of life of all citizens. That's our constitution, people. It is the law. And yet, of 5 million South Africans living without proper housing, 99% are black. Of South Africa's top 25 billionaires, 22 are white. So why has racial justice eluded us? Perhaps we can learn from the Truth Commission, which promised reparations to 22,000 people who fought apartheid, mostly black South Africans. Very little was ever paid due to the lack of resources. Is our Bill of Rights too weak to force real transformation? Is there a mismatch between economic policy and the law? In the final analysis, is the Constitution anti-black or can it be fixed? Welcome to the Big Debate. I'm Ridi Tlhabi. Joining me for this conversation are Yasmine Rukia, human rights lawyer and former TRC commissioner. Nomzamo Zondo, executive director for Socio-Economic Rights Institute. Wanelisa Xaba, PhD researcher and decolonial feminist activist, and Zuleika Patel, the young woman who fought racial discrimination at Pretoria Girls High. And we have a very special guest, Rukia Lumumba, a Black Lives Matter activist who directs the People's Advocacy Institute in Jackson, Mississippi, joining us live. In our virtual audience, of course, are South Africans concerned about dignity and racial justice. Welcome to all of you, and welcome to you at home. You can join the conversation using the hashtag on your screen. All right, let's start with our audience. When you think about the Constitution, do you think it is anti-black or it is the people who are failing to implement the Constitution? Is it anti-black? Who's nodding? Okay, just a few. Okay, we're going to hear your thoughts later on in the program. Yasmine, let me start with you. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission was meant to unearth the truth about what happened in the past, but also recommended some reparations. Very little was done in the way of reparations. The Bill of Rights in our Constitution talk about equality and dignity for all South Africans, and yet the face of poverty in South Africa is still black. Has South Africa's constitutional project failed?
What we have in South Africa is constitutional injustice. Injustices which occurred a long time ago have not really been rectified. And of course, that is because we've protected the rights of white landowners. We've not compelled people to pay reparations, and neither has the state done its job. And in addition to that, I think what we've seen is a real tolerance by our government for poverty and inequality, which is racialized. And that is leading to a real sense of critique, I think, of whether the Constitution can deliver. But I would argue that the failure is not so much that of the Constitution, but really of our government that has failed to honor the transformation commitments which were set out in the Constitution.
Nomzamo, let me bring you in here. You're a lawyer. You've represented people who perhaps have been victimized by the power of the state. Is the law on your side as you represent poor people?
The Constitution has been the one tool we've had. Unfortunately, we've been dealing with officials who refuse to accept the supremacy of that Constitution. And every now and again, we are forced to rely on the courts to remind politicians that we have the statement of intent that you read earlier on. But we are here today because the politicians have refused to honor that responsibility.
Wanelisa, please come in here. I mean, organizations such as SERI, Black Sash, Section 27, who have won some decisive victories in court, expensive victories, by the way. So the law is working, right? There's no problem in South Africa. Everyone can approach the courts and get justice?
Already people live in the township who earn less than minimum wage. They can't assert any constitutional rights. They can't defend any constitutional rights. They just don't have the access. the people who imported the legal systems that we work with, were white people during colonialism, and they had a particular understanding of what a human is. And that did not include Black people. That did not include women. It did not include the LGBTI people. And so what we're trying to do is to claim human rights for people the system does not see as human. And so it's a null and void conversation to even assert human rights for a system that doesn't see us as human.
Zukile, I remember when you stood up in front of power at your school, asserting your right to be Black and to have your hair as it is. And the rebuttal was, it's not about race, it is about school rules. But it was about your identity, wasn't it? It was about the right to have your hair as it is naturally. So what do you think about this, being unseen, being erased, and what did you as a young person learn about race and your place in the world through that experience?
It was not just about hair. And hair is much more significant than we think it is, especially in our oppression in South Africa as Black people. Under the apartheid regime, simply by how a pencil sat or moved in your hair, that then determined the standard of living that you would be afforded under that government. And that was then carried into our democracy, whereby even in our own communities, the tighter the curl is, the less human you are in your community. And also within spaces which are your historically white institutions, you are seen as a threat and as one that causes commotion just by how you look. And that all stems from our colonial past. As Black people, we're not seen as human in a country that is ours. We're seen rather as outsiders and dangers to society. And that image has been carried through many decades.
Yasmine, you are a former TRC commissioner, a human rights lawyer. I'm old enough to remember the TRC. We sat glued to our screens watching. And it was a moment of pain, but a moment of hope as well. It must be painful for you listening to someone like Zukile living the very thing that was supposed to be fixed by the TRC and its aftermath.
In the aftermath of the work of the Commission, a number of recommendations were made to government. And these would have assisted, if they were implemented, to really deal with what I would call the restoration of dignity. It would also have dealt with what I call the structural violations of both colonialism and apartheid, which remain, I think, the bedrock of the economic order in our society. And by the government not sort of following through, both on the question of reparations, on the question of land dispossession and reform, on ensuring that the beneficiaries of apartheid pay reparations, and themselves committing to really prosecuting those who didn't come forward. I think what we have is a tarnished rule of law situation, and that is really coloring the experiences of South Africa today. The fact that we didn't deal with the questions of racial inequality and poverty in our country. I talked earlier about our government tolerating this. I think they've become acquiescent and it doesn't bother them anymore, and people have just become invisible in their pain. The Constitution has a transformative element, but it is about the people who implement that Constitution. If you look at the last 23 years, one has to ask many questions around implementation and why we have lawfare in our country rather than a constitutional order.
Nomzamo, let me bring you in. I saw somebody tweeting that the ANC is anti-Black. And the context was a community that hadn't had a tap for decades. And the ANC comes in with their luxury cars during elections to campaign. So that was the tweet. It happened in the same week, the leader of the opposition laughing off the experience of a Black woman in a digital TV interview and chirping in that people don't care about race, they care about service delivery. And I'm thinking, these two things are inextricably linked. It can't be removed from the race question. Who doesn't have water right now? Who lives in communities where a shack fire can wipe out entire communities? So for the benefit of those South Africans who say it is your ANC government, because of course, because I'm Black, you can just see by looking at my face who I vote for. Anyway, it's your ANC government that is responsible for where we are. Of course, they are responsible for a huge chunk But how do we locate the very lack of service delivery within this race prism?
For me, the first thing that came as Yasmine was speaking was how I don't think the ANC government has acquiesced. I think they have, at certain points, gone out to attack the Black majority. If we address now the issue of special transformation, you look at how municipalities service poor Black communities versus how they service suburbs. And the response that we get is that people in the suburbs contribute to the process of the municipality, and therefore that's why they receive a certain level of service. Whereas we know why the Black majority is impoverished. We know they've been impoverished by apartheid, we know they've been impoverished by colonialism, we know that it's a structural issue. But we continue to have municipalities run by the DA, run by the ANC, treat Black people as if they are not worthy of dignity. They refuse them sanitation, they refuse them water, they refuse them housing. And in fact, our work as SERI has been around fighting evictions, where again, in the last 2 years, we've seen municipalities spearhead the evictions of communities even during the COVID-19 crisis. So if you want to speak about those two parties that I've mentioned, they've taken us a few steps back, and they must take responsibility for that.
When we return, we talk to a special guest from Black Lives Matter in the US, and we speak to activists fighting racist housing policies in Cape Town. Don't go away. Welcome back. You're watching The Big Debate. In Cape Town, 60% of the population, almost all Black, live in townships and informal settlements far from the city. In 2020, activists from Difunugwazi won a court victory, forcing the government to make available prime land in Sea Point for housing Black residents rather than selling to the highest bidder. But it's unclear if this court victory can do much to reverse decades of racially based housing patterns in the city. Take a look at this.
The Tafelberg case in Cape Town has been hailed as a major constitutional victory for the right to housing.
The judgment really took the state to task by saying, listen, you haven't done enough since the dawn of democracy to redress spatial apartheid.
But activists admit the Constitution has not been effective in fully realizing the right to housing for Black people.
One would very well say that the Constitution is progressive, but it doesn't have meaning to Black people, to a Black person that stays in a shack. They don't see the importance of this living document. They don't see the implementations of these values of equality.
The frustration is when people don't do their part in actually taking the necessary action to bring the Constitution to life.
The law allows the government to not build houses if they say there is no money. Politicians have used this loophole to escape accountability.
People need to understand the point is we can only build houses what our budget allow us to build. You would love to build more houses. You must remember the municipalities act as an agency of national government, the National Department of Housing.
What we've had is 15 years of a DA, starting with Helen Zille, a blame and complain politics. They are actually selling land that could be used for affordable housing to the highest bidder.
While DA and ANC leaders use the housing crisis in Cape Town as a political football, desperate residents have resorted to occupying unused buildings and land.
I didn't have nowhere to go, and we decided to be here as the home for us, as people that's colored and Black, that needs a place to stay in the CBD.
And the government has responded harshly to the occupations.
The point is, where did they stay yesterday? They stayed somewhere, they stay in shelter, even if the shelter is a shack structure. But what you see in Cape Town is a criminality issue as well.
We are not criminals, we are citizens of South Africa, and we have the right to live in the CBD. We have the right to live here with our families, near our jobs. The law doesn't protect Black and colored.
Right, we have Buhle Boy. You are an activist with Difunugwazi. Just referring to that, I'd call it a landmark victory in Cape Town. Many of your activists see that this victory, as significant as it is, will do very little to reverse 100 years of racist housing policy. What do you think?
At the heart of the problems that we have in South Africa is the land question that must be radically answered, and the release of prime land, which is at the heart of partial injustice in Cape Town. And part of the solution there is these constitutional wins and court orders that people get. But those in themselves have no meaning if there's no political will to implement the policies that the government adopts. So part of the problem is that in South Africa, we have well-written and sophisticated policies and a constitution that is hailed across the globe as a progressive constitution. Part of it is that the state has the role and the responsibility to expropriate land, but that is not happening. The state needs to undo spatial legacy and spatial injustice in Cape Town. Black people have no space in the inner city, so prime land must be unlocked.
Thank you, Buhle. Let's hear from Mam Barbara. You are also a land activist in Cape Town.
Exactly what you have heard from Sheila in AKH and Buhle as well. In the Western Cape, we have a huge challenge of the government of the Western Cape that doesn't want to release land to the poor people. For instance, when we occupied a building that was unused in Conrad, we were taken to jail for occupying that building. And yet now the building, it's a prime land. That is their language. They are using that building to build penthouses that we can never afford. Even if I worked for 30 years and got my 30 years pension, I will never afford a penthouse that will cost me 12,500 per month, and they are small. So they're chasing us away. We went to occupy another building. The fifth one, we occupied, they chucked us out. When we went out, we told ourselves, this time we are not moving. We are staying here and we are going to sleep on the pavement. And we did so. We were just celebrating 2 years sleeping in that condition. Western Cape government is anti-Black. They want to keep Cape Town white. I am very sorry to be speaking that language in this time and age.
Thanks, Mam Barbara. Okay, Wanelisa, I know that you've articulated your position on the Constitution and its framework. With that in mind, I still ask the question. We heard a Cape Town DA mayor saying these people come from somewhere. Where were they before? Basically, they are outsiders. They don't belong. So my question to you is, when the government claims that it does not have resources to build everyone a house, is it reasonable to expect the government to deliver housing to its citizens, regardless of which province and city they originally come from?
We need to ask this government, can they provide a dignified life for all people, for Black people in this country? But they can't provide that within a capitalist system and within a neoliberal framework that runs on like slave labor. So I can't answer you about housing because I don't think that Black people need a four-walled house. But we need to understand that during colonialism, what white people did, they have pillaged our land, and that our indigenous communities had a spiritual relationship with the land. And our work is to occupy that land and to heal the land, because capitalism is also another thing that really, really hurts our land, and it hurts our spiritual relationship to the land. I am from Cape Town. Right now, I'm in Langa, in Cape Town, and I seldom access to the beaches to go down to the beaches. I don't have access to go to Table Mountain. I don't have access to go to simple places in Cape Town because of racialized spatial segregation in South Africa. The deeper questions around land is not whether the ANC can provide those things. Of course, they can provide those things because Jacob Zuma has a fire pool. They found money for that. There's trillions that go out in tax evasions in this country like every year. There is money, but there's no money for Black people. Also, what I want to communicate is that as Black people, we need to be articulating our politics and our desires more than just a four-roomed house, because you get the four-roomed house and then what? It doesn't mean that you live a dignified life. You don't live a dignified life.
Nomzamo, let me bring you in here. I want to reflect very briefly about the Grootboom case. We know that it was historic. The Concord wrote what was lauded as a very progressive ruling around the government's responsibility to provide land for housing for marginalized people. We also know that Mrs. Grootboom died before that dream could become true. But here's the thing, even with the Grootboom ruling, it said that the government can provide this within available means, okay? And also talking about what's reasonably possible. I'm thinking about those terms, available means and what is reasonable, that invariably they create a loophole in which the government can hide and argue that taking land from billionaires, taking land from tenderpreneurs, taking land from very rich landowners is not reasonable, so we can't do it. So within available means and within the realms of reasonableness is a loophole that the government uses to not do anything.
There's Section 25 of the Constitution that we always hear people complaining that it protects white property. But within Section 25 of the Constitution, there's provisions, for instance, that say the public interest includes the nation's commitment to land reform. Out of the court from judgment, there were two housing policies that spoke to how informal settlements must be developed and what must happen in cases where people either are evicted or lose their homes in disasters. And those two policies, if they were effectively implemented, would mean that the people who are living in informal settlements would at least have, as a bare minimum, basic services. Would have another requirement of Section 25, which is secure tenure, because the state would have recognized that they live in those informal settlements and they would have made a long-term plan on how they will provide them with housing. But unfortunately, you can't even talk to the government about the Constitution, because when they address us, they speak about convenience. Yes, we had a big debate about whether we can expropriate without compensation. But when people ask the real questions about what have you done with that power to expropriate in the last 20 years, and the answer, unfortunately, is nothing. And earlier, Uvusi was saying, the reason is because there was clearly no political will to address that. So here, we're not complaining about what is in the Constitution. We're actually dealing with politicians who are not interested in ensuring that the public interest is met by making sure that there is land reform, who are not interested in making sure that there is equitable access to land for all South Africans, as demanded by the Constitution. The biggest impediment is the government that's been running this country. In fact, there's a few weeks ago, Seri was arguing a case where we were talking about, is it reasonable for the state to evict people simply because, as the Mayor Dan Plato said, they moved into the property a week ago or even the night before? Is that reasonable state action? And we had that argument in the Western Cape High Court. And unfortunately, it can't be reasonable, because in this country, we need to respond to the land question. If we don't address the land question, we are in effect sort of giving up.
Thank you very much. When we return, we ask if Black Lives Matter in the US, Africa, and beyond. Stay with us. Welcome back to the Big Debate. In May 2020, a white policeman knelt on the neck of a black man. After 9 minutes of saying, "I cannot breathe," George Floyd took his last breath. This was just one of hundreds of cases of racist brutality and violence directed at black bodies daily in the USA. When Donald Trump came to power, he fueled a backlash of white supremacy against racial equality, and this continues today. Black Lives Matter captured the imagination of millions of people of all races around the world who reject racism in all its forms. And yet in 2021, we still have Republican lawmakers in the United States passing laws to stop black people from voting. Rukia Lumumba, it's such a privilege to have you on the Big Debate in South Africa, live from Mississippi. Thank you very much. It looks as if the United States has just taken steps backwards in the last couple of years. Why is this the case?
I've been listening to the dialogue, and the same reasons that you are asking the questions about the Constitution, about access to water, about access to housing, about race and economy, are the same conditions and questions we're asking here in the United States. I am a member of the Movement for Black Lives, right? Which is an ecosystem of over 150 organizations across the United States that came together to collectively determine a Black agenda, a vision for our Black lives, and policy and practices, and an abolitionist approach to begin to shift this tide from white supremacy and capitalism to one that is actually about a dignity economy, about a solidarity economy, an economy that recognizes humans over profit. But one thing I want to do is give a little history about what's been going on here since the 60s and beyond. Because I think you'll see the similarities. People, say Mississippi is one of the worst states in the nation, but Mississippi is also one of the Blackest states in the nation. Mississippi is also the place that birthed what we now look at as the civil rights movement and led to the many laws that allow us to actually at least vote today in the United States. It's also a place where we have the most Black counties with the most Black representation. It's a place where we are seeing radical change in terms of our governance here in Jackson, Mississippi. What we're seeing is that governance can't come from a small body of people who are elected to represent us in some office. What we have to begin to look at is how do we change the tide from being governed as people to actually engaging in the governance ourselves. Governance that allows for assembly processes and participatory budgeting and participatory research development and policy design led by the communities most impacted by the housing need, by the need for water, things that are human rights, things that should be given by any government without cost to the people. For us to begin to develop those solutions as community members and not rely on these elected officials in public office. And that's a big task for us, but we have to shift because no longer can we wait on them to determine the destination of our policies and our practices.
It's so ironic that we did that. In the fight against apartheid, there was a lot of civic activism. But somehow with the dawn of democracy, a Black democratic government is told, we gave it all up. We now know that reversing centuries of structural racism is no mean task. What can you share with us then from your experiences as a citizen of a country that's been a democracy for so many years, but not in practice when it comes to Black lives?
Talking about the problem is not enough. We have to force them to actually implement the solutions that we have identified. The policies and practices that we as community members most impacted by the problem are saying is the solution. We're talking about policies like the BREATHE Act that was driven and divided and developed by community members, that withdraws money from institutions of policing that have consistently harmed our communities and invest that money into community-based organizations and solutions that are alternatives to policing. When we see those policies and solutions implemented and acted on, then we actually are going to see a true democracy where the people's word and the people's power is actually coming to fruition. We can't just sit and talk about it. We have to force their hand and move in it, or we need to move them out. You know, I'm talking as someone who has deeply engaged in the process of getting people elected, right? But I also recognize that the election of those individuals is not our end game. My father used to often say, he says, our goal in getting into governance is to deconstruct the system that currently exists, to create something new and better that actually results and resembles what we need as community. We have to begin to think about what does it actually mean to engage in a solidarity economy? There is a way to move people out of office, and I think that y'all have been doing an amazing job at trying to move people out of office in South Africa. And so, you know, one, I want to acknowledge all of the work that is happening, but I also just want to say that, you know, this is not a race, it's a marathon.
Let me bring in Yasmine. Rukia is in the United States where Black people are the minority, and yet so many years later, their right to basic services is still a daily battle. And then come to South Africa where Black people are the majority and the very same circumstances are a daily reality. What does this say about the global state of race relations and being Black in the world?
Well, it is about, I think, the colonial legacy of structural racism, which has underpinned both law and policy across the world, and which are really embedded in the institutions dealing with really the socioeconomic and political rights of people. And I think that when you look at that in our own country, we accepted the compromises of the Constitution, but we did that on the basis of a notion of transformative justice and a socio-economic rights regime that was justiciable in terms of the Constitution. And yet in the last 23 years, we have failed to deconstruct spatial apartheid and deal with it. We have yet to deal with the redress question around land. We've had a number of commissions, and last year we had the commission of the former president, Kgalema Motlanthe, which really spoke to the pain and suffering of our people, particularly in rural and tribal and urban areas. And yet none of these recommendations have found fruit yet. If you look at the fact that economic policies are built around maintaining a particular economic order, the question of redress in South Africa has just fizzled away. And yesterday you saw the Kulamani victims of political violence of apartheid spent 3 days in protest outside the Constitutional Court. And so I really do think that we are now at a point where we have to say that in a way the state is part of enforcing violence against Black people in our country. And so the electoral system has to change so that we can vote people directly into power. And I think a huge question we have to ask is, what are our national human rights institutions doing to really redress these injustices? But above all, I think this question of solidarity, how are we human if we ignore the indignity that ordinary South Africans live in our country, where in fact 60% of the population are unemployed, and where the questions of access to water, access to housing, access to land, access to electricity have all been laid bare by the COVID pandemic. And when you couple that with predatory elites who are in power, you couple that with the looting and corruption, the plunder that has taken place, where are the institutions that should be taking these cases to court on the basis that these constitute crimes against humanity? I would like to see the Human Rights Commission of South Africa bring a case against the government around the PPE looting, because that is a crime against humanity.
Zukile, I want to bring you in here as a young South African. How do you feel? I mean, your level of hope and optimism and confidence that we can achieve the change that Rukia talked about.
I do have confidence in my generation, because one thing that my generation has an understanding of is that freedom is not a destination, but rather it's a path. And it's a path in which we must still undertake in this country, because for as long as we're not economically free, for as long as we are not free from the remnants of the apartheid system, then we're not free at all. And so with regards to my generation and organizing, I think that the confidence that I have stems from the fact that we've already begun to challenge the system itself. We've already begun to nitpick where the problem lies. The post-94 generation is the generation of fees must fall, which saw how exclusionary the South African university system is. And then came my generation, which then spoke of institutionalized racism in former whites-only schools, and how it's not enough that you simply desegregate those schools, whereas then you don't change the policies and you do not do anything to change the cultures that uphold the institutions. And we seem to have a very good understanding of the fact that we have not arrived at that destination of freedom, which we pretty much for the past 27 years have assumed that we've arrived at.
Thanks so much, Zukile. And whether you believe it or not, you have made your mark on history, because I do know that in previously white schools, identity, hair, and expression is a big, big topic. So what you achieved is significant. But Rukia, just very quickly, I mean, in the United States, the taxing of rich billionaires, it is outrageous that they would pay less tax than poor working class people. And it's the same here in South Africa. The concessions to billionaires are allowing them some leeway to get their money out to tax havens and so on. We do know that in South Africa and in the US, the face of poverty is black. So if you're not going to tax the wealthy billionaires, you are basically saying that black lives don't matter, and you're not going to get resources from those who've benefited from labor and tax havens and economic policies that have benefited them because they are powerful. What are your thoughts around that? Because I heard your president speaking about it.
We need to tax the wealthier more than we tax the poor, right? That's period. But I think that, you know, that's an intermediate solution. It's not going to allow our communities to have housing and water and to ensure that people are living whole, healthy lives. Until we abolish this notion that capitalism is the system upon which our economy should be based, we will continuously see ourselves in this situation. Because capitalism says that there must be people at the bottom in order for people to be at the top. We have to begin to really think of what does it actually mean to create an economy that is not based on just simply dollars, but is based on resources that make sure that all of the people have what they need. What is the actual solution to actually implement and ensure that everyone has housing? that everyone has water. If the government is saying that the budget isn't there, and that's the same conversation we have here, well, what do we need to do in order to get the resources to get the people what they need? Because we see all of these abandoned houses over here in these neighborhoods. In short, I think we have to really begin to redefine what our economy looks like, because it's not an economy that has to be based on a dollar, but instead based on resources that help our people get what they need.
All right. Well, do Black Lives Matter in our Constitution? When we return, we hear from our audience. Welcome back to the big debate on racism and the law. Is our Constitution anti-Black? Let's hear your views as South Africans. Grant Moses.
I just want to ask this question on why are you saying that the Constitution is anti-Black? Because the Constitution itself was written by the ANC and it is a majority Black party. And secondly, why is everything black in South Africa when we are many people, especially colored people in the Western Cape, who are also struggling with housing? Why is it not spoken about colored people on the show? That's my other question I want to know is because we are also dying like flies here.
When I say Black, I also include colored communities. That's certainly what we do here on the big debate. And when you say, is the Constitution anti-Black, why am I saying that? It is the question. That's why we're here, to debate the question. It's clear, though, that you think it's not anti-Black because it was written by Black people. But I would say the race of the people who wrote it is immaterial. It is about whether or not the Constitution continues the patterns of exclusion, the patterns of isolation and oppression, and that's for you to answer. Who's coming up next?
We find that our Constitution is not anti-Black, but the implementation to walk the talking of the Constitution, it now tends to be anti-Black.
We need to understand that racism is economics. So the Constitution, the reason why we actually have it was to protect white interests. In 1994, we changed the government, but nothing else of the apartheid system changed. And as long as the apartheid system structures are there, it will keep on producing apartheid structured results. Doesn't matter who you change at the top. Because we need to understand that people who created apartheid were not small-minded people. They created a system that will outlive political people who are there. That as long as you keep it, it will produce it. And that's why, as a Black child, you can be Usbusiso from eThekwini. You won't have the same opportunities as a John from Sandton. So basically, we need to understand that we need to deal with structures and then deal with everything else.
I wouldn't say the Constitution is anti-Black, but I think there's a challenge in our government, specifically the officials, because I think they don't understand what is the meaning of whatever that is written in the Constitution. I think mostly what is being preached in South Africa, it's what is an advantage to those who are ruling us. There's no commitment to those who are ruling us and those who are policy makers to make sure that the Constitution is taking care of the majority in the country.
Our Constitution is progressive, but the problem is with the implementation. And as a result, politicians, business people, and common criminals are acting with impunity, knowing full well that there will be no consequences at the end of the day. My greatest problem is the very same issue of implementation. We have what we call sectoral determinations for the cleaning sector, as an example. And in terms of that particular determination, the workers must have provident fund, yet it's only 50% of the contract cleaning employers in South Africa who are compliant. The rest are not. As unions, we are trying to bring up all these issues up to the level of the provident fund adjudicator, but nothing is happening. This actually talks to whether the Constitution protects us. And in that case, it is really failing already. And I think it's only for people to be held accountable.
I stay at the occupation near the waterfront in Cape Town. We are experiencing problems with understanding whether the Constitution is for us or not. We are currently living in an occupation that doesn't have electricity for more than 4 years now. And we do not have proper sanitation. We do not have access to a whole lot of things in the economy that could help us while living in the CBD. in Cape Town. So we believe this constitution does not serve us at all. It only serves those who are rich. And with the new bylaw that is being passed by the DA, we really believe that this constitution is definitely anti-Black. And we are really now confused whether the PI Act, which is part of the constitution, can really serve us here or not.
For quite a long time, we're fighting for the places here around the CBD. They are nominated this place as a place of the domestic workers of Sea Point. So that's why we are occupying this place. In this place, we've got kids. We are staying in the darkness. We haven't got water. Service delivery are not applied in this place. We are the South African citizen. We are not gonna go to nowhere. We are the people of this country. So the government, it's a matter of must to do something for us. Crossing the road, there's a parking, which is it's got the electricity, but the human beings haven't got the electricity. So the cars are more important than us as a human being. It's very painful as a citizen of South Africa to live like this way.
You've said so many things that should force anybody who considers themselves a human being to reflect what's more important, a parking lot for cars or the lives of people. And if laws are to be made for law and order, for whom are we making the city orderly when poor Black residents are marginalized? Rukia, before I let you go, it was really a privilege to have you here on The Big Debate. And a last message for you as our special guest.
It's a deep honor to participate in this dialogue with you all. We, with the Movement for Black Lives, believe that our struggle here in the United States is connected to the struggles of Black people all over the world. We have a little difference, but in most part, they're the same. And we are committed to figuring out how we can actually solve the conditions upon which we're all existing and living. I wanna also just really challenge us to definitely remember that all folks that might be Black aren't folks that necessarily share the same ideas as us. And so as we are looking towards the future about how policy is developed and practices are created and implemented, that we need to really begin to think about who is leading us and what does that collective leadership look like. We need to start thinking more about not just people being Black that's in leadership, but people who understand the significance of ensuring that all of our people are fed, all of our people are housed, all of our people have what they need to survive. Because anything other than that is anti-Blackness. We have to, in the intermediary place, push our government to act. I think we got to take to the streets. We got to take to the phones. We got to take to all of the methods that it takes to actually to continue to do shows like this. And lastly, I think that we have to embody an abolitionist approach, an approach that allows us to vision and think outside of the boxes that we know. We have to begin to think about what is something imaginary that we haven't yet seen, and we got to build on that. We need to begin to think of how we deconstruct the system of apartheid is still in existence. Not only in South Africa, but right here in the US, right here in Mississippi, we are going through a lot of the same things that you were talking about right now. Together, I think that we can create a new trajectory, but we got to dream bigger.
Thank you, Rukia Lumumba. When we return, we hear final words from our panel. Stay with us. Welcome back to The Big Debate on race. We want to hear from our panel. Just final thoughts from you. I'm going to start with you, Zuleika.
I believe that it is not our constitution that is anti-Black, but rather our leadership that perpetuates anti-Blackness, in it leading in a very exclusionary manner, in it leading in a self-serving manner, in it upholding this apparatus that keeps Black people away from access to healthcare, access to education, access to opportunity, access to employment, and that makes it perpetuate anti-Blackness. I believe that we have an excellent constitution. However, it comes in the implementation and in the understanding of our constitution and in those who are granted the power to implement our constitution. That's where the problem lies.
Thank you, Zuleika. Nomzamo?
There's something for me that comes up, which is about how do we build people's power to ensure that those who are in power, and here I don't think we're only speaking to the executive, we are also speaking to those who are in parliament who have failed to oversee what the executive is doing. And we're also talking to the judiciary who are tasked with making sure that this constitution comes to life. And I want to say to all South Africans, it's time for us to build the power to hold these people accountable and remind them what we wanted in 1994. And if it means we build back to a point when we were as powerful as we were towards the end of the 80s, the beginning of the 90s, so that we can remove them completely, then we must do that.
Wanelisa?
The notion that all of these things have come as a result of the ANC slacking off is a very dangerous notion, and it's very intentionally misleading. When the compromise and the selling out was very economically and politically thought out, and it required our government to cut back on healthcare, on social spending, on all the things that will make Black people live dignified lives. The very common conversation I am having is with Black people who are saying, you know what, we want to leave the city, we want to go back to the rural areas, and we want to till the land, and we want to heal the land, because we're working in corporate environments that are racist, that are homophobic, that are patriarchal, and really they kill our soul. And I really want to employ young Black South Africans, and I mean all shades of Black, that we need to reimagine a world in which it has economic and political systems that serve the humanity of our people and the environment of our people. We will never thrive under this economic system. It's an economic system, but it's also an ideology.
Thank you very much, Wanelisa. Yasmine, final thoughts, please.
I think what we've heard is that race matters, but you can't eat the Constitution. And one does come away with a feeling that we've let our people down. And so what I would argue is that we need a new discussion on questions of redress, accountability, and a new economic model based on the values of human dignity and the notion that we cannot be human if we ignore the humanity of the other. And I think that these are the questions that we should be asking our politicians, how they're going to deal with transformative justice. And we should be asking the same questions to those who aspire to the Constitutional Court and who aspire to be the Chief Justice as well. We need to test out how they really think about solidarity and economic well-being of all South Africans. Thank you.
When Desmond Tutu called for a rainbow nation, it seemed within grasp. In 2021, it seems like a distant dream. What will it take for South Africa to provide a decent life for every one of its citizens, especially the marginalized Black communities? Can the Constitution be called on to ensure, in Nelson Mandela's words, that never again will this land experience the oppression of one by another? You decide. I'm Ridi Kabi, and you've been watching The Big Debate.